Hi, my name is Holly. I'm a museum manager at Edison Ford Winter Estates. Each month I do a digital discussion on a topic of interest, and I'm getting to do one on somebody that I greatly admire, that has a lot of information about them, and that person is Theodore Roosevelt. What inspired me to do this particular presentation was I was at the Sanibel Library doing a presentation on the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And after the meeting, this very nice gentleman asked me if I knew about a book called The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, The Women Who Created a President. And his son had written it. It'd come out 2 years before. And by the way, I immediately ordered it, been reading it. It's a great resource and a different, perspective about Theodore Roosevelt. And by the way, his son is also the person that has created the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library out in North Dakota, which we will mention later on. But that was the inspiration. Teddy Roosevelt, which he didn't really like to be called, is somebody that I've always wanted to do a presentation on. But wow, is he a broad topic? And I'm trying to get him up here. We're losing his head. There he is. That is the Theodore Roosevelt doll that I bought my husband about 25 years ago. No, he does not play with dolls, but we both liked him, and they're like collectible dolls. And it's him going to the Spanish-American War. So I thought it would be fun to have him here, though he doesn't show up very well. But I thought he might be inspirational for me. So Theodore Roosevelt in War and Peace. And if you have questions as we go along, there is a chat and you can put your questions in there and I will answer them at the end. And I just wanted to mention that book, and that is Edith Roosevelt, his second wife. And I highly urge you, that's a great book to read. So Theodore Roosevelt's born in October of 1858. He's from a very wealthy New York family. He's educated by private tutors at home. He goes on to enroll at Harvard when he was just 17. He is the second child of Theodore and Martha Bullock Roosevelt. His father was a glass importer and he was a philanthropist, while his mother was a Southerner, and she had to adjust to life in New York above the Mason-Dixon line. He had an older sister, Anna, who I will be talking about. I will talk about all of his siblings, a younger brother, Elliot, and a younger sister, Corinne. Family called the young boy Teddy. He was considered frail. He actually did have very poor health with poor eyesight and asthma that troubled him throughout boyhood. And some of that stayed with him for the rest of his life. He led an active childhood rich in intellectual curiosity. He loved to find out about things. I'm sure you're all aware of his love of nature. And he also liked to read, but he merged the two things through his study of nature. And sometimes the odor of his dead specimens, mice, birds, fish, etc., did little to endear him to people to be around him because they smelled bad. But his parents encouraged his intellectual curiosity. Like his father, Teddy had great curiosity, energy, determination, and he had compassion for those that were less fortunate. His father realized that Teddy faced significant physical challenges. On nights when Teddy's asthma was particularly bad, Theodore Roosevelt would take him for rides in the family carriage, hoping that the movement would force air into his lungs. And what's interesting is he also does something like with a cigar and cigar smoke. And he was also the first to, I don't know how much that helped his breathing, but he was also the first to suggest Teddy might need glasses. And after his son realized that his son could not even see a target, he took him for an exam. He was 13 and he was extremely nearsighted. So he got glasses, opened up the whole new world around him. And his father took him aside one time and said, "You have the mind, but you have not the body. You must make your body." And he began to exercise. A gymnasium was installed for the Roosevelt children to use because each of them had health ailments. Due to their various issues with health, all of the children were homeschooled and they were taught by their mother and their Aunt Anna, and by a French governess. So all of them had health issues. None of them went to public school. But their curiosity was encouraged by their parents. This will be the home in New York where Theodore Roosevelt grew up, and it belonged to his grandparents, and then they would live there. It would be the place that he was born in. I'll tell you a little more about the home in a minute, but here, I don't know, I have another picture where it's circled, but this is Abraham Lincoln's funeral procession. And why is that of interest? Well, that home there that you can see, the second one in, that's the Theodore Roosevelt home where he grew up. And why is this important? Well, if you look here and see where it's circled, let me tell you a little bit about that. It was Theodore Roosevelt's wife, Edith, who identified the boys. Yes, I think that's my husband, and next to him his brother. Edith Roosevelt told the photojournalist Stephen Laurent. She recalled at the age of 3, she had joined her future husband and his brother because they were very good friends. And Edith didn't necessarily have an easy childhood herself, but she spent a lot of time with the Roosevelts. And she joined them at the window, but she saw all the black drapings. She started to weep. They didn't like me crying, so they took me and locked me in a back room. And there they are in the window. As President Theodore Roosevelt referred to Lincoln as my great hero and said that he meant more to me than any other of our public men. Noting a Lincoln portrait he had hung up on his office wall in the White House, he said, I look up at that picture and I do as I believe Lincoln would have done, which is a pretty good standard. One of my heroes, too, is Abraham Lincoln. This is his home in Oyster Bay, New York. Originally, his family would go there in the summers and they would rent a place. But later on, Theodore had a home built there when he was an adult. And I believe that is also a historic site. And this is Theodore Roosevelt's mother as a young woman here, the one that says 1857. And I believe the one down the bottom of both of his parents is from the 1870s. And Theodore Roosevelt is famous for promoting a strenuous life. Remember, he began his life as a frail asthmatic child, and then he is encouraged by his father to make his body, and he transforms himself through physical discipline. And his father believed in taking up exercise, and to deal with bullies, he also started taking boxing lessons. We'll hear about boxing lessons later on. And 2 trips abroad had a permanent impact. They went on family tours of Europe in 1869 and 70, and of the Middle East in 72, 73. And his mother, Mittie, her name is Martha, was the mother and the of Theodore Roosevelt and the grandmother of Eleanor Roosevelt. I'll let you ponder that one for a minute. And she was witty and tart, and she could be sharp-tongued, and it said with a strong, vibrant personality. And the common historic view of her as a valetudinarian, and boy, I butchered that, product of the antebellum drawing room, which actually means that like she was sickly all the time, and a fainting couch. But her life was often shows strength and not weakness. And I think she's underestimated for her strength. She was an active, involved mother who recognized the needs of her precocious, unusual son. Mittie is the source of 2 of Theodore Roosevelt's greatest strength, his personality and his resilience. And that's from a webpage that Edward O'Keefe has. And I agree, she is highly underrated. Because his father was known as such a strong personality. Well, in the late 1800s, brownstones were going out of fashion. So Theodore Sr. moved his family to a mansion in West 57th Street below Central Park and next door to his Uncle James. Theodore was 14 years old. The brownstone where he was born on 20th Street was sold. Why is this important? Historic site. At first, bay windows were added to the 5-story brownstone when it became a store in 1896. Then it was demolished to be replaced by a 2-story retail building in 1916. 3 years later, Theodore Roosevelt died. This is the father. His family bought back the store and his brother's original brownstone next door. They built them into a replica of the Theodore Roosevelt birthplace circa 1865, with 5 period rooms, 2 exhibit galleries, and an auditorium. It opened in 1923 as the Roosevelt House. It's privately run by the Women's Roosevelt Memorial Association until 1962, when it becomes the Theodore Roosevelt Birthplace National Historic Site run by the National Park Service. You can visit today. It's a recreation of what was there. And since I referred to that book about the loves of Theodore Roosevelt, I thought I would tell you a little bit about the women who had an impact in his life. I can't do the justice that Edward O'Keefe did to it, but I can whet your appetite enough so that you want to go out off and find out more. And by the way, before I get to that, I do want to mention that the Civil War comes, and it does have an effect on Theodore Roosevelt's family. His mother is from the South. His uncle's fighting for the South, and actually his mother is able to visit them over in Europe at one point. And by the way, Theodore's father wanted to sign up and go off to the Civil War. She's already got her brothers fighting for the opposite side. And his daughter, Bammy, Theodore's sister, said that mother was very frail and felt it would kill her for him to fight against her brothers. So he gives in, even though he desperately wanted to go off to war. And Theodore Roosevelt Sr. reluctantly gave in. Instead of serving in uniform, he paid 2 substitutes. But he had persuaded Abraham Lincoln to establish the Allotment Commission, and then spent the better part of 2 years moving from army camp to army camp, talking to soldiers into sending at least a part of their pay home for their families. It was exhausting work, but the fact that he had been kept out of combat, well, that bothered him his whole life. And it haunted he felt that he had done a very wrong thing in not having put every feeling aside and joining the absolute fighting forces. His decision would haunt his son as well, leaving him with a question he could never quite resolve. How could his father, the father he remembered as the best man I ever knew, have failed to fight for the Union? And Theodore, we believe, felt like he needed to compensate for that again and again. Now, here's some of his siblings, siblings and the women in his life as well. And this is his sister, Anna, who went by many names, including Bammy, short from Bambina, given to her by her mother, and Bai, for which she was called by her siblings and many nieces and nephews. She's going to become Theodore Roosevelt's political advisor, if women were allowed to be political advisors then, and she certainly did that. She's had a very strong personality. Unfortunately, she had something called a Pott's disease, which was a tubercular spine. She had to wear braces. It was very uncomfortable, but she was a very strong woman. She's going to do many great things to help her family. Eventually, she helps her brother after his first wife dies. She supports her cousin James when his wife died, and she goes to London and she meets somebody, and Rear Admiral William Coles, and they're married, and she has their first and only sibling when she's about 40 years old. But she was the strong person in the lives of her sibling and nephews. And Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who didn't easily give out comments, Theodore's first child from his first marriage, called her greatest influence. And Anna would have, she had a big impact on his presence in Washington, D.C. She held parties, special meetings. And we know, here's one thing that says, considering Anna's diplomatic personality, Alice Roosevelt Longworth should have said, if Auntie Bai Anna had been a man, she would have been president, which is kind of sad that you think that the world was such a place that women could not serve in that capacity at that time. Here's Theodore's younger sister, Corinne. She's born in 1861, so the start of the Civil War time. She's the fourth and youngest child. Connie, as she was nicknamed, was a playmate of Edith Carmen Thoreau, which is Theodore Roosevelt's second wife. And she was also one of Theodore Roosevelt's biggest supporters. She shared stories of his actions in Cuba, his lively family life in the White House to the press, taking on the role of the unofficial press secretary long before the role existed. She secretly sat in on political meetings and afterward advised her brother. She was a talented writer, a poet, and after his death, became one of the first women in history to address one of the two major party conventions in 1920. And she knew all the family stories, by the way. And she really was a great unofficial press secretary for her brother. And you know that the convention she addressed was the Republican convention. And I will tell you that the other Roosevelts, Franklin Roosevelt's family was from the Hyde Park area. And of course, he married Eleanor. That was their cousin. But what was interesting to me is that Eleanor Roosevelt is the granddaughter of Mitty, and her politics took a different direction. So there's the Oyster Bay and there's the Hyde Park Roosevelts. But Connie will be the only one that actually will support FDR when he runs for office because he was family and also because she believed in some of his platforms. And believe it or not, they did have platforms that were similar in some areas. I didn't have time to go through all of that. And I think you probably recognize her because she looks very similar today. And that is Eleanor Roosevelt, and that's her father, Elliot. And Elliot was the third child of Theodore Roosevelt and Mitty, and was the younger brother of the president and the father of future First Lady Eleanor. He was very talented, very intelligent. One place I read that said he had seizures. He certainly had health issues. He struggled throughout his life with poor health, migraines, alcoholism, and emotional instability. He traveled and developed a reputation as an adventurous sportsman. In 1883, he married yet another Anna Hall, and they had three children, Eleanor, Elliot Jr., and Gracie Hall, who went by Hall. Elliot was unable to overcome his alcoholism. Treatments in the US and Europe failed, placing increasing strain on his marriage and family life, and a series of personal tragedies accelerated his death. Anna died in 1892. Their son, Elliot, died in 1893. And at times, I have to be honest, that Theodore kept him away from his family because he felt his behavior was so harmful, and they didn't really know how to help him at the time. So that also happened. And also, Elliot took up with his wife's assistant, made something along that road. And he had a child, illegitimate child as well, that some of the family members did stay in touch with. But he spent his final years in deteriorating health, and he jumped from a window in August of 1894, and he died the following day at the age of 34. And sadly, I think for the children, the surviving children were raised by their maternal grandmother in New York, who was not always a very pleasant person. Here's Theodore. He goes to Harvard, determined to become a biologist, and that's him like at the age of 17 in 1876. But he shifted to politics because he found the science he was taught in Cambridge so bloodless. He didn't get much out of his classes. He said, I was taught laissez-faire doctrines, then accepted as gospel, basically. But there was no teaching of the need for collective action, or the fact that in addition to, not as a substitute for individual responsibility, there's a collective responsibility. Harvard mattered greatly to Theodore, but mostly because of the experiences and personal growth it provided, not because of what he learned there, and he did do very well because he had a nearly photographic memory and he was a very curious person. And he said, I thoroughly enjoyed Harvard, and I'm sure it did me good, but only in the general effect, for there was very little in my actual studies that helped me in afterlife. But sometimes I think we fail to realize that something has made an impact at the time. And he's a longtime bird lover, by the way, and he made several visits to the St. Regis Lakes with his friend in the Adirondacks. And they compiled a list of 97 birds they had seen in the Adirondacks with brief notes describing each bird. And there it is. It was published as Summer Birds of the Adirondacks. On February 9th, 1878, Theodore Roosevelt Sr. collapsed and died at 46. He died of bowel cancer. Theodore, his son, rushed home from Harvard, but arrived too late for a farewell. The loss devastated him. Sometimes when I realize my loss, I feel as if I should go wild, he wrote. He was everything to me. I have lost the only human being to whom I told everything. With the help of my God, I will try to lead such a life as he would have wished. For the rest of his life, his father's example remained one of Roosevelt's defining touchstones. And here we have that the one with the scarf tied around his head is Theodore. To his right is Elliot. Down below Elliot is their sister Connie. And then down at the very bottom sitting is her childhood companion, Edith. And it was long assumed that he and Edith would get together. But that summer at Oyster Bay, while still in mourning, Theodore endured another blow. He and Edith, his childhood companion, had long shared a closeness that seemed likely to end in marriage. Yet one afternoon in the summer house, they quarreled and ended their relationship, and neither one ever disclosed the cause. Theodore later confided to Bammy, only that we both of us had tempers that were far from the best. In the aftermath, he sought relief in motion. He attempted to master both anger and grief through rowing and riding and all kinds of physical activity. After graduating from Harvard, he studied law for a year at Columbia University, but he dropped out to pursue politics, winning a seat in the New York Assembly in 1882. But most importantly, he married Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt. Alice, who only lives to be 23, was born in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts, to George Cabot Lee, a banker, and Carolyn Watts Haskell Lee. And she had met Roosevelt while he was a Harvard student and became the object of his intense courtship. And he pursued her for 2 years. Remembered by family as sunshine, Alice was greatly admired for her lively disposition. She was very athletic and she was very refined and accomplished a great deal. After initially refusing Roosevelt's proposal, she accepted in 1880, so she would have been 19. They were married on October 27th, 1880, his 22nd birthday at First Parish Unitarian Church in Brookline, Massachusetts. They honeymooned at Oyster Bay and then settled among the Roosevelt family in New York City. And even though they were very close with Edith, she fit right in and they loved her. And in New York, Theodore pursued law, writing, and public life and politics. In the 1880s, the early 1880s, Alice moved within the social circles of elite New York and accompanied Theodore as his political career began. Following his election to the New York State Assembly, she spent time in Albany and became acquainted with the world of state politics. By 1883, Alice was expecting their first child. The Roosevelts planned a future at Oyster Bay, purchasing land for a new home called Lee Home, which he would build and become Sagamore Hill, while Theodore also turned attention westward to the Dakota Territory, so he's been to the Dakotas already. As her pregnancy advanced, Alice turned to Theodore's family home in New York. On February 12th, 1884, she gave birth to a daughter, Alice Lee Roosevelt. But soon afterwards, her health failed from Bright's disease, a kidney disorder that went undetected during her pregnancy. As a tragedy. Theodore hurried home from Albany through severe winter weather and reached her bedside before she died on February 14th, 1884. His mother, Martha Mitty, had died earlier that same day of typhoid fever, which is from contaminated water. After a joint funeral at the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt was buried in Greenwood Cemetery. Her daughter, later known as Alice Roosevelt Longworth, survived her. Theodore Roosevelt's mother had died 11 hours earlier of the typhoid fever I mentioned, and there was a double funeral there. And the next day, their infant daughter was christened the day after the funerals. This is Teddy Roosevelt's diary from that day. There's a big X, and he said, "The light has gone out of my life." And I can feel his pain. After the funeral for Alice and Mitty was held on February 16th, Roosevelt was devastated by the near simultaneous deaths of his wife and his mother, and was described as dazed and stunned. The losses made him an orphan. It shattered the home he began to build with Alice Lee and left him reeling. After the funeral, he left his newborn daughter with his older sister and returned to Albany. Refusing to flinch or yield, he kept working, attended the Republican National Convention in June, but chose not to seek re-election. And he's devastated. And of course, we can think about maybe his daughter needed him, but I think he was so devastated, and she reminded him of her mother, but he could not bear to be around her, to be quite honest. So he went west again to a Dakota Territory Elkhorn Ranch. Though he called his daughter Baby Lee, he admitted, "There never can be another Alice to me." And there he is in Dakota. Roosevelt later wrote a remembrance of his mother and his wife, describing Alice Lee as a joyful, tender, and newly a mother when death came to her. He concluded, "The light went from my life forever," and he rarely spoke of his first wife to anyone again, even after marrying Edith Thoreau in 1886, 2 years later. And he did come back home some, but he was out in Dakota, depending on what you read, 2 or 3 years. Roosevelt found renewal in the American West, where learning to ranch, ride, and survive strengthened him physically and emotionally. He came to believe that the wilderness and the frontier experience fostered important American values such as individualism, liberty, and independence. During this time, he began writing The Winning of the West, a study of frontier life and the people who lived there. He wrote a trilogy of books about his time there, and over his lifetime wrote 30 books. The beauty and isolation of the West helped ease the grief with the death of his first wife, Alice. After droughts and severe blizzards devastated his cattle herd, he returned east, but viewed his years in Dakotas as essential to his future success. He ran as the Republican candidate for the mayor of New York, but although he lost the campaign, it increased his public recognition and strengthened his political career. He rekindled his friendship with Edith Kermit Thoreau and proposed to her, and he sailed over to England, where he married her shortly after the mayoral election. Theodore and Edith settled at Sagamore Hill in Oyster Bay, Long Island, and between 1887 and 1897 had 5 children: Theodore Jr., Kermit, Ethel, Archie, and Quentin. And there they all are. There's President Roosevelt, there's the First Lady, and their 6 children: Quentin, Theodore the third, Archibald Archie. There's Alice, she's the tall one in the picture. Kermit and First Lady. And I'll talk a little more about them. Edith Kermit Carew Roosevelt, the second wife of Theodore Roosevelt. Teddy, see, I'm falling into that habit, even though he didn't use that very often. And First Lady of the United States from 1901 to 1909, was a childhood friend of Roosevelt and a member of a prominent New York family, though her life was not always easy. And after the death of his first wife, which she had somehow, to her credit, maintained a friendship with, the two renewed their friendship and married in 1886. And she helped raise Theodore's daughter, Alice, though at times it was very tough and they didn't always hit it off. But then sometimes Alice would say some kind of things about her. But I think she was closer to her aunt, Bammy. As First Lady, she modernized White House operations, expanded the executive residence, and carefully managed the Roosevelt's family public and private lives. She was known as a very intelligent woman, discreet and strong sense of duty, and she was one of Theodore's most trusted advisors. Following his presidency and his death in 1919, Edith made active in family affairs and public service. She died almost 3 decades later, and in 1948 is remembered as an influential First Lady whose stewardship helped shape the modern White House, and that is on the cover of O'Keeffe's book. While continuing to write books, Roosevelt waited for an opportunity to return to politics. In 1889, Benjamin Harrison, the president, appointed him to the U.S. Civil Service Commission. Theodore worked to reform government hiring practices by promoting the merit system, where jobs were awarded based on qualifications rather than political favoritism. In 1895, he resigned from that civil commission to become police commissioner of New York City. He reformed the police department in the same way he had reformed civil service. He fought corruption aggressively, insisting that promotions and appointments be based on ability and performance, not on political connections. He removed many corrupt or ineffective officers and replaced them with more qualified individuals. And there he is, working for the police commission. Roosevelt actively campaigned for the Republican presidential candidate, William McKinley. McKinley later appointed him Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Roosevelt had long wanted the Navy position because he believed a powerful Navy was necessary for the U.S. to become a major world power. He worked to modernize and expand the Navy by building warships, upgrading equipment, and improving training programs. Anticipating there could be a possible conflict with Spain, he pushed to ensure that the Navy would be ready for war. As Assistant Secretary of Navy in the days following the sinking of the USS Maine in 1898, he found opportunities to apply his theories. Briefly, as acting Secretary of War, he mobilized the Navy for war with Spain. He ordered supplies and ammunition, sought support from Congress to recruit more soldiers, and ordered the North American and Asiatic squadrons to prepare for war. Roosevelt's aggressive actions set in motion the machinery that soon would lead to the conquest of Cuba, Guam, and the Philippines. And there's on the bottom, on the left, is the Secretary of the Navy, and on the right is Theodore as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. But something's going to change. What's going to happen for Theodore is a war is going to break out. And this is taken in Tampa when the Rough Riders were all gathering there. And there he is with a tent in Cuba. And America had become interested in Cuba's liberation in the 1890s as journalists, periodicals, magazines focused on the evil of Spain's rule over Cuba. No one favored independence for Cuba more than Roosevelt. As Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he prepared the Navy for war with Spain because they controlled Cuba. The US battleship USS Maine was sent to Havana, Cuba. After a few uneventful months, it was anchored in Havana Harbor when the Maine suddenly exploded, killing 269 American soldiers. Spain denied blowing up the Maine, but a U.S. Navy investigation concluded that it was caused by a mine. The cause of the explosion, to be quite honest, remains a mystery, but some American journalists and Roosevelt were convinced it was an act of war by Spain, but plenty of people don't think there's any proof that that happened. But shortly after this, war was declared, and sensationalist newspapers like the New York Journal and the New York World seized on this, coining the rallying cry, "Remember the Maine." You've heard that before, I'm sure. To hell with Spain. It was more likely an internal accident, possibly a coal dust fire or boiler failure, though the exact cause is still uncertain. Roosevelt petitioned the Secretary of War, Alger, to allow him to form a volunteer regiment. Although he had 3 years of experience as a captain with the National Guard, Roosevelt deferred the leadership of the regiment to Leonard Wood, a former war hero that he had a friendship with. Wood, the colonel, and Roosevelt, who was at that time lieutenant colonel, began recruiting and organizing the first U.S. volunteer cavalry. They went through 23,000 applications, obviously something to do with the fame of Roosevelt and the people that would be in the regiment. Roosevelt's fame and personality turned him into the de facto leader of this unusual group. There were polo players, hunters, cowboys, Native Americans, and athletes that were college buddies, and they became known as Roosevelt's Rough Riders. And there's Teddy Theodore. The Rough Riders participated in 2 important battles in Cuba. The first action they saw occurred at the Battle of Las Guasimas on June 24th, when the Spanish were driven away. The Rough Riders lost 7 men with 34 wounded, and Roosevelt narrowly avoided bullets flying by him in the trees, showering splinters around his face. He led his troops in a flanking position, and the Spanish fled. American forces then assembled for an assault on the city of Santiago through the San Juan Hills. Keep that in mind. Colonel Wood was promoted in the field, and in response, Roosevelt happily wrote, "I got my regiment," because he became the colonel. The Battle of San Juan Heights was fought on July 1st, which Roosevelt called the greatest day of my life. He led a series of charges up Kettle Hill towards San Juan Heights, which means there was more than one, but it kind of got dropped. So everybody thought he went up San Juan Hill, but actually he went up one of the San Juan Heights, which was Kettle Hill. He led a series of charges while the Rough Riders followed on foot. He's on a horse. He rode his horse Texas while the Rough Riders followed. He rode up and down, encouraging his men with the orders to march. He killed 1 Spaniard with a revolver salvaged from the Maine. Other regiments continued alongside of him, and the U.S. flag, the American flag, was raised over San Juan Heights. Hostilities ceased after Santiago fell to siege, and the Treaty of Paris gave the United States its first possessions from this war: Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The war had lasting effects. The splendid little war, I don't think any war is splendid, but that's what it was called, lasted 10 weeks. It destroyed the Spanish Empire and ushered in a new era of American empire. Roosevelt's political career ignited as he returned as a war hero and a national celebrity. He charged on horseback to victory at Kettle Hill and collectively San Juan Heights, and continued, figuratively speaking, riding that horse all the way to the White House just 3 years later. Roosevelt was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor 100 years later for what was described as acts of bravery on July 1st, 1898, near Santiago de Cuba, Republic of Cuba, while leading a charge up San Juan Hill, actually, San Juan Heights, Kettle Hill. And there he is in Cuba. And I will tell you that Teddy thought this said that this was the greatest day of his life. But I will say that the Edison family was affected because mine is youngest brother, who was one of those young men that were caught up in the excitement of going, is actually shot during this battle. He survives 6 days and dies, and Mina will name her youngest son Theodore after her brother Theodore. Roosevelt's fame as a war hero helped him win election as governor of New York. As governor, he followed a moderate approach, avoiding the more extreme reform proposals and the demands of conservative party leaders. His independence and reform-minded policies frustrated many Republicans. Traditional party bosses felt he was unpredictable and difficult to control. Think about that. You had to control somebody. The Republican National Chairman, Mark Hanna, referred to Roosevelt as that damned cowboy because of his time out west. In 1900, Roosevelt expected to run for a second term as governor. Instead, the New York Republican leaders pushed him onto the national ticket. They didn't want to have to deal with him anymore as William McKinley's vice presidential candidate. Their goal was partially to remove Roosevelt from New York politics, where he was challenging established political machines. Mark Hanna could see the consequences beyond New York State. Exasperated, he exclaimed, "Don't any of you realize there's only one life between that madman and the presidency?" He was not a fan, obviously, of Roosevelt, because if something happens to McKinley, he will become president. But Roosevelt eventually will agree to make the other Republicans happy to accept the nomination. He thought perhaps he might be able to run for the presidency in 1904. After winning a landslide election with his running mate, President William McKinley was shot at the Pan American Exhibition in Buffalo. Dwayne, my husband, has told me that his grandmother was there that day when that happened. Did not witness it, though. And 6 months after he became president, Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was in Vermont, not that far from New York. So he immediately left to be near the president, McKinley. But after a few days, it looked like his condition seemed stable. Roosevelt was encouraged to return to his vacation plans near the Adirondacks. But McKinley's condition worsened. He was rushed back to Buffalo, but was informed en route of his death. Roosevelt took the oath of office on September 14th, 1901, at the private home of Ansley Wilcox. At 42, he was the youngest man ever to become president. Some things about his presidency. He advocated for the square deal, aiming to balance the interests of labor, business, and consumers. He immediately focused on monopolies. He's a trust buster, which is when several companies join together and they're so powerful. He broke those up. They controlled everything. They controlled oil, beef, railroad, and other industries. Trust had become so powerful that people were suffering from high prices, low wages, and poor working conditions. Roosevelt became known as a trust buster for breaking up these monopolies by forcing the dissolution of the great railroad combination in the Northwest. Other antitrust suits under the Sherman Act followed, and his willingness to take on corporations and monopolies enhanced his popularity with the American public. Under his presidency, steps were taken to protect consumers from unsafe products and fraudulent business practices. Two key pieces of legislation were passed: the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, the Safety and Purity of Food and Drugs, and the Meat Inspection Act to inspect meat processing plants and make sure that there was sanitary standards. Theodore Roosevelt was often called the conservation president, and he impacted the national park system well beyond his term in office. He made conservation a top priority during his administration. He created the U.S. Forest Service and established 150 national forests, 51 federal bird reserves, 4 national game preserves, and 5 national parks. during his time in office. He's commemorated at 6 locations of the national park system. Oh, his birthplace, Sagamore Hill, the inaugural national site in Buffalo, the national park in North Dakota, and Theodore Roosevelt Island in Washington, D.C. all trace his career and memorialize his contributions to America. And he's also one of 4 presidents that are on the Mount Rushmore National Memorial in South Dakota. He signed the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act. He continued to oversee construction. Oh, he advocates for workers' rights, resulting in better conditions. He didn't always make himself popular. He continues to oversee the Panama Canal. He visited it, but it wouldn't officially open until 5 years after he left office. The U.S. had control of it for $10 million and a yearly payment. The Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt corollary to that, prevented the establishment of foreign bases in the Caribbean and gave the sole right of intervention in Latin America to the U.S. In 1902, he intervened in an anthracite coal strike, which threatened to disrupt the nation's energy supplies. He took a proactive role as a mediator, bringing both labor representatives and mine owners to the negotiating table. The outcome was the creation of a commission to address worker demands, and it led to improved conditions for coal miners. I don't want to lead you to thinking he was perfect. He was a human, and he made mistakes, as many men of the time. That's not excusing him. Did, but his record on race was mixed and reflected the racial attitudes of the era, and that is not excusing it. He accepted beliefs in white racial superiority, and did little to resist the disenfranchisement of Black voters, though he appointed some African Americans. And he had a major controversy in his presidency when he had Booker T. Washington from Tuskegee Institute at the White House in October. He wanted to talk to Washington about patronage appointments in the South. And he was surprised by the vilification he received in the white Southern press, but I don't think he should have been. He did not apologize for that, nor he defended also Minnie Cox, the country's first African-American female postmaster, after she was driven out of Mississippi because she was Black. He appointed Black Americans to prominent posts, including Dr. William Crum as customs collector in Charleston, despite political opposition. Roosevelt responded, "I cannot consent to take the position that the door of hope, the door of opportunity, is to be shut upon any man, no matter how worthy, purely upon the grounds of race or color." However, his most serious failure came in the Brownsville affair in 1906. A small group of Black soldiers was accused of going on a shooting spree in Brownsville, Texas, killing one white man and wounding another. Now, he dishonorably discharged 3 companies of Black soldiers without a trial, despite the conflicting testimony and little physical evidence. It was assumed that the soldiers were guilty without giving them the opportunity to prove their innocence, and this is a political campaign cartoon. And I do wish that he had allowed that to happen. The other thing I'll say is that when Roosevelt took office in 1901, he continued and expanded policies. Some of his conservation policies marginalized Native American people. He supported the Indian Allotment Act, which broke up tribal lands into individual plots and undermined the tribal government and sovereignty. He moved them from their homelands to make way for national parks. Sometimes we don't think about those consequences. And he encouraged Native Americans to adopt Euro-American lifestyles and drop cultural practices. Despite his harsh policies, Roosevelt did show some administrative familiarity with Indian affairs, having worked with the Indian Service and advocating for certain reforms, such as placing Native Americans in higher civil service positions. But it didn't alter the framework of the assimilation and land removal. That 200 million acres of protected land came at a cost to Native communities, Many of these lands had been managed by Native people for centuries. And these are 6 Native Americans that did appear in his first inaugural parade. And one of them was Geronimo. I think it was to have familiarity that people would know who they were. Roosevelt mediated the Russo-Japanese War, the first American president to receive this honor, known as the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905, ending the Russo-Japanese War. His successful negotiations earned him the Nobel Peace Prize, making him the first American to receive this prestigious award. The treaty resulted in the establishment of peace in the Far East and showcased Roosevelt's diplomatic skills and commitment to international policy. And he is not actually present at this, though he certainly sent people there. But this is in the shipyard in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Kittery, Maine. And so he trusted the naval yard to make sure that things were done properly, because that's in my home state of New Hampshire. And then the people that were participating in that stayed in Newcastle at Wentworth by the Sea, which was a very elegant hotel and has now been restored. Roosevelt also believed that a powerful Navy was the key to maintaining peace. In 1970, he sent the Great White Fleet around the world to demonstrate the U.S. naval power. Before he left office, Roosevelt handpicked William Howard Taft as his successor and worked to get him elected. And he had served in the Roosevelt administration as governor of the Philippines and Secretary of War. And he vowed to run the country just as Roosevelt had, but it was off to a rocky start with the outgoing president. Taft soon discovered that he'd be better served by his own secretaries. Roosevelt's a little miffed at this, having his cabinet members dismissed when he was promised they wouldn't be, and not being consulted on new appointments. He's the grand man of the Republican Party. So after his inauguration, Roosevelt traveled in Africa and Europe for more than a year. He went on safari with his son Kermit. He met up with Edith in Egypt, and the two of them journeyed throughout Europe, encountering constant demands to meet and greet royalty and politicians. When they returned to New York in June 1910, they were greeted by one of the largest mass receptions ever given in New York City. He was frequently visited by old friends who decried Taft's supposed efforts to undo what Roosevelt had accomplished, and he was pressured by the progressive wing of the Republican Party to challenge Taft in 1912. So Roosevelt decided to throw his hat in the ring and challenge Taft. He weighed his options. He's going to run against his former protege. In 1912, he became the first candidate as a political cartoon for the nation's highest office to formally endorse suffrage rights for American women. Remember, he has women that were a big influence on his life. With Taft controlling the convention floor, Roosevelt split from the party and formed his own party. It was called the Progressive Party, and it became known as the Bull Moose Party because it was so strong. Its tenets included political justice and economic opportunity, and it sought a minimum wage for women, an 8-hour workday, a social security system, a national health service, a federal securities commission, a direct election of U.S. senators, which didn't happen then. And near the end of the campaign, he's insisted on finishing a campaign speech, even with an assassin's bullet lodged in his chest from an assassination attempt. Fortunately, the bullet had been slowed down by the pages of a thick speech, and he had in his coat pocket. But still, his act was courageous, but maybe a little foolhardy, because this is what they loved about him. And by the way, that remained in his chest for the rest of his life. But the split in the party, he got more votes than Taft, but Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, got the most votes. And so he did not win the election. Roosevelt also steered the United States into world politics. He liked to quote a favorite proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick. I love this one. It's not the critic who counts, nor the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, and strives valiantly, who at best knows in the end that the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly. That sums up Teddy Roosevelt to me. And this quote, patriotism means to stand by the country. It does not mean to stand by the president. And it said, believe you can, and you're halfway there. The River of Doubt, which is a book I read back probably in 2005, tells the story of Teddy's. I got to stop calling him Teddy because he really didn't like it. He only refers to himself as Teddy 12 times. But I learned that as I was undergoing the reading about him. So his last great adventure in 1914, and I did read this book called River of Doubt. And as he called it, was his last chance to be a boy. Following an invitation to speak in Buenos Aires, he gathers a party to explore the uncharted Rio da Dúvida, River of Doubt in Brazil. Their mission was to chart the unknown river, collect specimens for the Museum of Natural History in New York, which he was a big supporter of. The River of Doubt was a twisting, treacherous waterway with whirlpools, rocks, and sharp turns. Every bend threatened disaster. The men had to cut new canoes from trees using dull axes. They survived on parts of palm, river fish, and what few animals they could hunt. He got a severe leg infection, cutting his shin on a rock, and which eventually became gangrenous. He was feverish. He hallucinated. He told Kermit he might not survive. By the time the expedition finally reached civilization, months later, they had lost their canoe, most of their supplies, and several men. Roosevelt had lost nearly 60 pounds and was carried out of the jungle, barely conscious. He later admitted that he had come within a finger's breadth of death. His health never fully recovered. It did a number on everyone's health that was there. And so I think that's one of the reasons his life is cut short. When Theodore Roosevelt was 58 years old and nearing the end of his life, he read an article by Russell Coles describing his expedition to hunt the giant manta rays in the Gulf of Mexico. The article, titled My Fight with the Devilfish, appeared in the American Museum Journal in 1916. And he's a longtime supporter, as I mentioned, of the New York American Museum of Natural History. And he read the story later that year. He reaches out to Coles, who is only a few years younger than him, and he accepted an invitation to join another manta ray hunting expedition. Roosevelt traveled by train to Punta Gorda, then boarded a steamboat to the eastern side of Captiva Island, where a one-room barge served as his base camp. At the time, Roosevelt was deeply involved in political matters connected to the First World War. Nevertheless, he was excitement about hunting a giant manta ray, which he referred to as a devilfish, seemed to overshadow all other concerns. And he does write about this trip in a story for Scribner's. And by the way, this fish is not dangerous. And as much as Teddy did conserve land and things, he also, as probably most of you know, was also a hunter and a fisher. And these are the people that are on this trip. From the western side of Captiva Island, the sunsets were wonderful across the Mexican Gulf. There was a growing moon. The nights were very lovely. There was warm water. It was an enjoyable trip. That's quoting Teddy. Learning that President Theodore Roosevelt was aboard a vessel in the Gulf, this young woman, Margaret Mickle, set out and rode out to meet him herself. I came to see Teddy Roosevelt, she told a guard on the steamer's gangway. She was born, I think, on McGregor, but I think at this point she was living on Captiva. There's just so many conflicting stories about his visits there and her. I'm just going to see him. That's all there is to it. And the boat she went out in, by the way, sunk. Roosevelt soon emerged from a cabin doorway, stepped toward the Captiva woman. I believe she was a teen at this time, and welcomed her warmly. remarking that he preferred to be called Teddy. Well, not truly from what I've studied, but the larger-than-life former president then photographed her and afterwards captured one of the two of them together, which I had because I'd love to put it up. Within days, the encounter traveled beyond the coast, and it was carried in national newspapers. The New York paper talked about him being there, going after the devilfish and harpooning the marine monster. Teddy Roosevelt and Ding Darling weren't actually on Sanibel or Captiva at the same time. But this is a summary from what I saw in the news press, and said that they both shared a love of nature, especially Sanibel and Captiva Islands. So they became friends for a few years before he died, but they never met up out in the island. And here's a timeline of his connection. He establishes the Pelican Island Reserve, the first federal bird sanctuary near Sebastian. He establishes executive orders establishing the Pine Island Wildlife National Refuge. He visited Sanibel and Captiva Islands to hunt manta rays. I'm not so sure about the Sanibel, though it says that. He dies in 1919. Truman signs an executive order creating the Sanibel National Wildlife Refuge, which eventually gets renamed the Ding Darling Wildlife Refuge. And some other places say he was there in 1913 as well, but I didn't really find anything that proved that. In 1918, he underwent an operation to remove abscesses from his thigh and his ears. And as a result, he lost hearing in his left ear. And at that time, he revealed he had been blind in his left eye since 1905. He lost the sight when he was boxing with a military aide in the White House. He was hospitalized on November 11th. On January 6, 1919, Theodore Roosevelt died from a blood clot that had lodged in his heart. His funeral takes place in Oyster Bay with a simple service at Christ Episcopal Church and burial at the Young's Memorial Cemetery. Despite the harsh weather, 4,000 people gathered outside the church, while about 500 invited friends and relatives attended that simple service inside. There was no music and there were no eulogies. Edith continued her world tour by visiting Europe, South America, Hawaii, the West Indies. She also edited a history of her genealogy with her son Kermit and assisted the aging rough members of her husband's Rough Riders with money as needed and raising funds. Edith resurfaced in the public eye as opponent of FDR's 1932 presidential campaign. And I forgot to mention that when Eleanor marries her distant cousin and their distant cousin FDR, Uncle Theodore walked her down the aisle. A proud Republican, she chaffed at what was a misconceived to be a close relationship with her niece's Eleanor's husband and spoke at a rally for the incumbent Herbert Hoover. But eventually she developed more respect for FDR and his New Deal policies and maintained cordial relations with that branch of the family. And she died away at her home in 1948 in Oyster Bay. And here's Theodore's children. And I thought you might like to hear quickly a little bit about them. And there's his children. There's Ethel. There's Alice from his first marriage. Quentin, next to her. Kermit holding the guinea pig. And Archie. And then Ted with the dog, 1901. Quickly to tell you that his youngest son, Quentin, was full of mischief and brought a pony into the White House. He grows up. He goes to Harvard College. He goes to fight in World War I. And this is tragic. He's shot down behind enemy lines, and he dies July 14th, 1918. And Theodore Roosevelt, will die 6 months later after his son's death. I should go back for a second just to quickly tell you about his other children. Archie had a strong military career. He also goes to Harvard. He becomes a business executive, and then he was in World War I. He goes off to World War II. He's injured by a Japanese grenade. I'm sure that none of you are surprised that they did go off to join the military. And while his brothers served in World War I, Kermit decided to enter the British Army. He served in Mesopotamia, which is now Iraq. And then he will uh, go on two daring expeditions with his brother in 1925. And then when World War II begins, he signs up for the British Army. And unfortunately, poor health forced him to leave. And he was posted to Africa as an officer, and he ended his own life there. And Ted Roosevelt is commissioned a lieutenant colonel in the 1st Infantry, and he wanted to lead men in combat. And he helped found the American Legion. All of his children accomplished a great deal. And his other children, Edith, married a surgeon, but despite having 4 children, she refused to stay at home. And when World War I breaks out, she joins her husband in medical service in France, and she campaigns for national conservation and civil rights. She's very active. And finally, Alice. Alice, I remember reading about when I was a teenager. And Theodore Roosevelt, one of the lines he says is, I can either raise the country, I can run the country, or I can tend to Alice, but I cannot possibly do both. And she had a pillow on, she was the grand dame of the Republican Party, and she had a pillow on her sofa that said, if you don't have something nice to say about somebody, come sit by me. That was Holly's revised standard version, but you get the idea. She loses her mom at a young age. She is very close to her aunt Bammy. And remember, he calls her Baby Lee, her dad, because he can't. That was one of the few nicknames she permitted people to call her by. Because remember, it's a reminder of her mother. She lost her mother. She's a leading figure in DC. Sometimes she has conflicts with Edith. But she's a partier. She goes on late night parties. She expresses her opinions in politics. And she had a child. Some people believe it was not from her husband, who she married, that was a senator in Longworth, but someone else. And then when her daughter dies young, she does raise her granddaughter. So Alice had quite a life here. I never would have been president without my experiences in North Dakota. And when I told you about the book about the loves of Theodore Roosevelt's life, I learned that there was a presidential library, which you've all probably heard about. But back in the winter, I didn't know this was being built, and it's now open in Medora, North Dakota. And look at the roof. It's made out of natural materials. It looks like an amazing library. And they have a wonderful website where you can take quizzes and get all kinds of information about Theodore Roosevelt. And this is a very condensed version of his story because there is so much more to say. And here's the last thing I'm going to tell you about is that how the story of the teddy bear. This is the one thing he didn't mind being called Teddy, and I've already slipped up 3 times, so I need to work on that. But he was on a hunting trip, and he didn't shoot a bear. We do know he likes to shoot. But so somebody decided to tie a bear to a willow tree and wanted the president to be able to shoot that bear. And guess what? He wouldn't do it. That's not how whether or not we agree with his shooting, the animals, that's not how he would do it. But that became a cartoon drawing the line in Mississippi. And this is an original replica of the first Theodore bear, or as we call them today, teddy bears. And here's a lot of my sources. And yes, he is the one that says, speak softly, but carry a big stick. And yes, he did finish a speech with a bullet in his chest. He is an amazing man. He's not perfect, but I urge you, I hope this whet your appetite So you will look up more on Theodore Roosevelt. This is the one I put the most hours into ever, and it was such a broad topic that I couldn't do justice. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next month.